It was a damp, cold, rainy evening. The world was quiet and still, as if everyone had already turned in for the night. The lights in the windows of everyone's homes had been extinguished, and the hustle and the bustle on the streets had died out. Under the cover of the night, the man draped a hood over his head, and with his face downcast towards the ground, he left his home, hoping that he wouldn't run into anyone that he knew. He slowly closed the front door of his home, trying not to make a noise that would wake his sleeping family. Immediately, the man realized that he hadn't thought about a very important part of his late-night adventure. He hadn't taken into account that the moon was full and shone brightly, casting a glow on everything in his view. He crept down the street, his eyes and head darting around, making sure no one was up ahead or back behind him. After his eyes had adjusted to his new environment, he saw an alleyway between two buildings up ahead. As he got closer, the outline of something or someone came into focus. He froze, petrified that he was about to run into someone who would recognize him. He exhaled deeply when he realized that it was only a stray dog eating out of the garbage can stored in the alley. He continued on his journey, slinking in and out of the shadows. The final hurdle that he would have to cross was walking out into the fully open air, uncovered from the protection of the shadows, to knock on the door at his destination. When the man arrived, he took a deep breath, exhaled, and knocked on the door. Immediately, the door opened as if the person who answered knew that this man would be making his late-night visit. Just recently, when Anna Kate and I have traveled, we have gotten into the habit of listening to podcasts. If you're unfamiliar with the idea of a podcast, it's like a radio show, but over the internet. It can be accessed by a cell phone or a computer. Most podcasts tell a story of some sort or deal with a certain topic. Anna Kate and I love the mysterious, sometimes spooky, but engaging storytelling of certain podcasts. On our last trip, halfway through a podcast story, I looked over at Anna Kate and said, "I love podcasts. It's like watching a movie, except for with my ears." She died with laughter, and after the statement came out of my mouth, I realized just how peculiar it sounded. But it's the truth, and it's the best descriptor that I have. The story that I began by telling would easily be a podcast story that Anna Kate and I would be sucked into from the moment that it started. But if the storyline sounds familiar, you would be correct, because it comes from our gospel lesson today. As the reader and the hearer of this story, we find out a lot of information from the first two verses of the story. The first is we find out who the main character is, his credentials, and the time of day in which he went to visit Jesus. We learn that Nicodemus is a Pharisee, a Jewish leader of the highest order, and we know from all of the other gospel stories that we are so familiar with that Pharisees are indeed the people who caused the most problems for Jesus and his ministry. It seemed as though every time Jesus was in a public place teaching or preaching, there was always a Pharisee there to challenge his teachings. The second thing that we learn about Nicodemus is that he goes to see Jesus. Now, that is not the interesting part of the story, because we know that Pharisees interact with Jesus often. The interesting part of the story is that he goes to see Jesus under the cover of darkness. Going under the cover of darkness implies a couple of things. The first thing is that Nicodemus is going at a time of day when it is less likely that he is going to be seen by someone whom he doesn't want to be seen by. It also implies that his motives might be different than a typical Pharisee going to heckle Jesus. And also because Nicodemus goes to where Jesus is instead of heckling in a public place. The final part of the beginning of this story that is interesting is how Nicodemus refers to Jesus. And this is the part of the story that really tips us off as the hearer of the story, that Nicodemus might not be like other Pharisees that we hear about in the other stories of the Gospels. Nicodemus refers to Jesus as the rabbi who has been sent by God. Could this be a peace offering sent from once bitter rivals? Or is this a change of heart from one individual who has seen the great works of Jesus and is wanting to know more? The two launch into a conversation that is intriguing, to say the least. But before we go there, I need to make a disclaimer before I move on. Some might call this a conspiracy theory or fake news, but I would like to say on the record that I believe that our pastor plans his vacations around the difficult texts that show up in the lectionary. And the rest of today's gospel lesson would certainly fit into that category. So let's wade through it together. Jesus makes an interesting statement to lead off the conversation, and that is, I ensure you, unless someone is born anew, it is not possible to see God's kingdom. This is where the first red flag is raised. And this is a statement that has been debated by theologians for centuries. The Greek here is translated born anew or born from above. But many English translations, and you can check your own, use the phrase born again. Probably from the response that Nicodemus says after Jesus makes this statement. Now, I know that school has just gotten out for many of you. And for you teachers in the room, students are the last people that you want to think about at this point in time. But nonetheless, I want you all to think about a classroom. There are many different types of students that you find there. There are the quiet kids who rarely raise their hands to answer a question. There are the kids who just like to hear themselves talk, who answer the question regardless of whether they have the right answer or even know what it is. There are the know-it-alls who like to show they are smart by being the first one to raise their hands to answer the question. And then there are the smart aleck kids who answer a question with another question, trying to stump their teacher. Whatever Nicodemus's intentions were for coming to see Jesus, he still had a little bit of that Pharisee smart aleck in him, because he responds to Jesus' claim with a question. And Nicodemus asks, how is it possible for an adult to be born again? Fair question, But for anyone who has been following the life and the work of Jesus would have known that Jesus often used examples like these to get his point across. Some call them parables, but I might put this particular story into the hyperbole category. The conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus continues with Jesus trying to communicate a message to Nicodemus, and Nicodemus not being able to fully understand Jesus' message. The darkness and the shadows that Nicodemus used to keep himself concealed as he traveled to this meeting with Jesus followed him inside, and Nicodemus cannot seem to escape those shadows to understand Jesus. Now today, you all are going to get a 2-for-1 deal because our Old Testament lesson is just too important not to mention. It comes from one of my favorite books of the Hebrew Bible and maybe even the entire Bible. Lamentations is a fascinating book for many reasons, not limited to the structure of the book, the language that is used, and the realness of the pain and the agony experienced by the writer and their portrayal of the agony of the people living in Jerusalem. For historical context, and please excuse my nerdiness for just a moment, this book was written sometime after 586 BCE, after the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians and in lament of the death of King Josiah. What is interesting about this text is it is written in a poetic form called an acrostic, using the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The beginning of each line of the 22 verses in each chapter corresponds to each of the Hebrew letters. This is true for every single chapter in Lamentations except for chapter 3, and it is in the form of what we call a double acrostic, with our Old Testament lesson positioned smack dab in the middle of chapter 3. From front to back and start to finish of the book of Lamentations, we see the author, who we believe is the prophet Jeremiah, using some of the strongest language imaginable to describe the experience of the people in Jerusalem. Death, destruction, lamenting, and anguish are themes that can be found all throughout this text, except for in the verses that are our Old Testament lesson today. In the midst of all of the pain and the destruction, Jeremiah has a moment of hope, a moment of clear-headed thoughts. The shadow that had been following this prophet went away, if only for a moment, allowing him to see that through everything God is still good, and that God's mercies are new every single morning. Through the conversation with Jesus and that Jesus and Nicodemus have, Nicodemus couldn't get over the idea of an adult being reborn. He couldn't get over the imagery of childbirth to see what Jesus was trying to say to him and to say to us. We often don't see the complete picture of a situation until the very end. Maybe it's because we've been too close to the situation, or all of the information wasn't communicated to us. Since graduating earlier this month, I have made it my goal to reread all of the Harry Potter books, which I haven't done since probably middle school. After having read all of the books once and having watched all of the movies multiple times, rereading the books have taken on a whole new meaning for me. Whether intentional or not by J.K. Rowling, from the first book on, I have picked up on bits and pieces of foreshadowing that informs the very ending of the story of Harry Potter, even in the very first pages of the very first book. Like Nicodemus, the shadow of Harry's circumstances follow him throughout his entire written story. And it isn't until the end of the story that Harry is presented with all of the facts, and the shadow that has been following him goes away, and he can then see the full nature of his own circumstances. Even though Nicodemus is trapped underneath his own shadow of his story and his entire conversation with Jesus, Nicodemus shows up 2 more times, both later in John's gospel. Do you remember where? He shows up for a second time after the temple police have failed to arrest Jesus, and then again after Jesus' closest followers and friends have fled the scene of his death, and no one is there to take care of Jesus' dead body. After Jesus had died, a man comes out from the shadows, a Pharisee by the name of Nicodemus. And knowing that his actions would change his life forever, he asks for Jesus' body so that he could make sure that he had a proper burial. In the conversation with Jesus, Nicodemus might not have understood what Jesus meant by being born anew or born from above in relationship to fully seeing the kingdom of God. And we don't know if Nicodemus has a moment of clarity like Jeremiah in the book of Lamentations between the time we meet him and his bold moment of asking for Jesus' body. But in that very moment, Nicodemus had been born anew and was able to fully see God's kingdom and the importance of the life and the work of Jesus. Nicodemus collecting Jesus' body was the first time that is the last time that we hear about him in the gospel stories. So we don't know what the rest of his life looked like. But it doesn't keep me from wondering, did Nicodemus slink back under the safety and the comfort of his shadow? Or did he live fully into the knowledge of knowing the one who came and flipped this world upside down? I would contend that this being born anew that Jesus told Nicodemus about was not a solitary or a one-time event. I believe that it is a process that happens time after time. Just like Jeremiah's proclamation in Lamentations 3 that God's mercies are new every morning, so too is the call to be born again. We have the opportunity as people of God and followers of Jesus to be born anew every single morning and every single day, because it is then that we have the opportunity to step out of the shadows of our own stories and our own circumstances to see the new mercies of our God. May it be so. Amen.